The night I realized my husband had erased me from my own life, I was lying in a hospital bed in Santa Rosa, California, listening to the soft mechanical rhythm of machines that were keeping me alive, while the world outside quietly decided I no longer existed. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 52 years old, and for the first time in a marriage that had lasted nearly 3 decades, I understood something with terrifying clarity. Survival does not guarantee safety. The surgery had gone well, the doctors said, complicated, invasive, necessary, but recovery would take time. Time, as it turned out, was exactly what my husband, Thomas, needed. While I drifted in and out of medicated sleep, my phone unanswered on the bedside table, documents were being signed, accounts redirected, signatures replicated with alarming confidence. I didn't know any of this yet. All I knew was that Thomas hadn't visited in 3 days. No flowers, no calls, no excuses. Just silence. And silence, I would later learn, can be louder than betrayal when it's intentional. When a nurse gently asked if there was anyone else we should notify, something inside me shifted. Not fear, not sadness, but instinct. The kind that whispers when danger is already inside the house. I asked for my phone. The lock screen showed dozens of missed alerts I couldn't open yet, messages that made no sense, bank notifications I didn't remember setting up. Somewhere between the sterile smell of antiseptic and the hum of fluorescent lights, a truth began to surface. Thomas hadn't just abandoned me while I was vulnerable. He had begun rewriting the story of my life as if I were already gone. It started with a single email I almost ignored, buried beneath appointment reminders and well wishes from coworkers who assumed I was resting comfortably at home. The subject line read account access updated, and at first I thought it was a routine security notice, one of those automated messages banks send every few months. But something felt off. The sender was a joint investment account Thomas and I had opened years earlier, back when we still spoke in plans instead of tensions. My hands trembled as I opened it. The message was brief, clinical, and devastating. Your access privileges have been modified. No explanation, no warning, just that single sentence. I refreshed the screen, logged into the banking app with growing unease, and watched as my dashboard loaded incomplete, unfamiliar, hollow. Accounts that had always been there. Retirement funds, emergency savings, even the small education account I'd kept for my niece, were gone. Not frozen, not flagged. Gone. I tried again, assuming pain medication was fogging my vision. Same result. A cold pressure settled behind my eyes as the implications sharpened. This wasn't an error. This was deliberate. Thomas knew exactly when to act, when I was unconscious, sedated, legally vulnerable. The man who used to kiss my forehead every morning had waited until I couldn't stand, couldn't speak, couldn't fight back, and then quietly pulled the financial floor out from under me. In that moment, lying there in a hospital gown that didn't even feel like it belonged to me, I understood the true shape of betrayal. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was efficient, calculated, and dressed in paperwork. When I finally confronted him, it wasn't in anger. It was in disbelief so deep it almost felt like calm. Thomas answered the phone on the 4th ring, his voice light, distracted, as if he were standing in line somewhere instead of dismantling our life. I asked him plainly why my access to our accounts had been removed. There was a pause, just a second too long, and then he sighed, the sound of a man already tired of explaining himself. He told me it was temporary, that things had become complicated, that the lawyer had advised him to simplify matters while I recovered. Simplify. That was the word he used to describe stripping his wife of financial identity while she was still connected to IV lines. He spoke gently, carefully, the way people do when they think you're too weak to argue back. He even reminded me, casually, that the doctors had mentioned cognitive fog as a side effect of anesthesia, suggesting I might be confused. That was when the last trace of doubt vanished. This wasn't panic. This wasn't poor judgment. This was strategy. He believed I would accept his version of events because I always had before, because I had spent years being agreeable, trusting, choosing harmony over scrutiny. I hung up without responding, my heart pounding not from fear, but from clarity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering if I was being deceived. I was wondering how long it had been happening, and how far he thought he could go before I noticed. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended state, as if my body was healing while my life was being dismantled somewhere beyond the hospital walls. Nurses came and went, adjusting drips, checking vitals, offering kind smiles that felt almost cruel in their normalcy. Meanwhile, I lay there replaying every year of my marriage with new eyes, recognizing patterns I had once dismissed as quirks or stress. Thomas had always preferred control disguised as concern. He handled the hard stuff because it was too much for me. He insisted on being the point of contact with lawyers, accountants, insurance agents, not because I asked him to, but because he volunteered so eagerly that refusing felt ungrateful. And I had let him. I had let him because I trusted the version of him I thought I knew, the man who held my hand at funerals, who cooked dinner when I worked late, who told everyone I was the strongest woman he knew. Strength, I now realized, had never impressed him. It had simply made him patient. On the fourth morning, a hospital administrator stopped by my room to confirm discharge details, and when she asked about my insurance guarantor, she hesitated. "According to our records," she said carefully, "your status was updated." "Updated how?" I asked. She looked at her tablet again, her expression shifting. "You're listed as deceased." The word landed like a physical blow. Deceased, not separated. Not incapacitated. Dead. My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Somewhere in a government database, in a system designed to be unquestionable, my existence had been quietly erased. And Thomas had done it so thoroughly that even a hospital, where my heart was still beating, where my name was printed on the wristband around my arm, was being told I no longer counted. That was the moment fear finally gave way to something else. Resolve. Because whatever he thought he was building on my absence, he had made one fatal mistake. He assumed being erased would make me powerless. He never considered what happens when a woman has nothing left to lose except the lie holding everything together. I didn't scream. I didn't demand to see a supervisor or threaten legal action the way movies teach people to do. Instead, I asked the administrator to sit down and repeat exactly what she was seeing on her screen. Her discomfort was immediate, but she did as I asked, turning the tablet so I could read it myself. There it was in plain text: status, deceased, date filed 2 weeks earlier, signature authenticated, documentation verified. Thomas hadn't panicked or improvised. He had planned this. I felt a strange, almost chilling calm settle over me as the implications unfolded. Declaring me dead wasn't just about money, it was about control, about speed, about removing obstacles before they could speak. I thanked the administrator, asked her not to make any further changes, and requested copies of everything. When she hesitated, I looked at her directly and said, "I'm still alive, and someone has committed a very serious crime." That changed everything. By the time she left the room, my file was flagged, internal calls were being made, and for the first time since waking up from surgery, I felt the balance shift, slightly but decisively. Alone again, I stared at the ceiling and allowed myself one honest acknowledgement. Thomas didn't just think I was weak, he thought I was finished. And the kind of man who believes that will always overreach. What he didn't know, what no one ever suspects until it's too late, is that women like me don't survive by luck. We survive by learning, by watching, by waiting. And if he had taken my name, my accounts, and my legal identity, then I would take something far more valuable in return: his certainty. The first call I made after the hospital flagged my file wasn't to the police or a lawyer. It was to a woman named Marion Lowell, a forensic accountant I'd met years earlier at a charity board meeting and never thought I'd meet again. At the time, she joked that most financial crimes weren't committed by strangers in masks, but by people who shared your last name and knew your routines. I remembered that line with painful clarity as she answered on the second ring, her voice sharp, alert, unmistakably awake to danger. I didn't dramatize what had happened. I didn't need to. I simply said, "Marion, my husband legally declared me dead while I was in surgery, and I need to know exactly how." There was a pause, brief, professional, and then she told me to send whatever documents I had and not to contact Thomas again. That instruction alone felt like armor. Over the next 48 hours, as I recovered physically, Marion worked quietly, efficiently, tracing paper trails that had been designed to look clean. Shell trusts, emergency amendments, a power of attorney activation timed to coincide with my medical incapacitation. Everything had been filed through legitimate channels, exploiting the fact that systems are built to trust paperwork more than people. And that was his second mistake. Because those same systems leave trails, timestamps, authorizations, inconsistencies that only look invisible to people who don't expect anyone to check. When Marion came to see me in person, she didn't bring sympathy. She brought a folder thick enough to change lives. "He rushed," she said plainly. "He assumed you'd be too embarrassed, too tired, or too afraid to push back." I smiled for the first time in days, not out of joy, but recognition. Thomas hadn't outsmarted me. He had simply mistaken my patience for passivity. And patience, when it runs out, has a way of becoming something far more dangerous. When I was discharged, I didn't go home. That house no longer belonged to me in any way that mattered, not emotionally, not legally, not safely. Instead, I checked into a small extended-stay hotel on the edge of town, the kind designed for people between lives. Traveling nurses, contractors, women who don't ask questions because they're too busy rebuilding. From that neutral space, I began doing what Thomas never imagined I would do, move quietly but decisively. Marion coordinated with a civil rights attorney and a federal compliance officer, not because we needed drama, but because accuracy mattered. Every form Thomas filed carried his fingerprints, his timing, his intent. Declaring someone dead isn't just fraud, it's a cascade of crimes, each one triggering another. Insurance manipulation, identity theft, false government reporting. And the most damning part, he had done it all believing I wouldn't survive long enough to notice. I watched the process unfold like a woman watching a storm approach from behind glass, detached, observant, unafraid. There were moments, late at night, when grief tried to slip in wearing familiar clothes, memories of shared holidays, the man I once believed would hold my hand if I ever couldn't stand. But grief didn't stay long. It couldn't. There was too much clarity now, too much truth filling the space where denial used to live. Thomas had erased me on paper, but in doing so, he'd revealed exactly who he was when he thought no one was watching. And once you see someone clearly, you stop mourning the version of them that never truly existed. What remained wasn't anger. It was resolve, sharpened by the knowledge that I didn't need to destroy him. I only needed to let the systems he abused finally see him. The unraveling didn't happen all at once, and that was almost poetic in its precision. It began with small interruptions in Thomas's carefully managed life, bank accounts temporarily frozen pending verification, an insurance payout delayed due to discrepancies, a notice requesting additional documentation he couldn't easily provide. Each interruption was minor on its own, the kind of inconvenience people like him usually brushed off with confidence and irritation. But confidence only works when the ground beneath it is stable, and his was already cracking. I learned through Marion that he'd started making frantic calls, leaning on professional relationships that had always worked in his favor before. Only this time the tone had changed. People were polite, cautious, suddenly very thorough. Systems that once moved quickly for him now slowed to a crawl. Compliance reviews were initiated. Government databases flagged conflicts between his filings and the hospital's records. The word deceased was being quietly walked back, replaced with fraud investigation pending. And all the while I said nothing. I didn't call him. I didn't confront him. I didn't even ask how he was doing. Silence, I discovered, was far more unsettling than accusation. In that silence, Thomas had to sit with his own actions, replay them without the comfort of my forgiveness or confusion. Meanwhile, I focused on restoring my identity piece by piece. My name reinstated, my records corrected, my legal existence reassembled with the same care he'd used to dismantle it. Each confirmation felt less like victory and more like restoration. As if I were slowly stepping back into my own skin. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore, I was reclaiming continuity. And the most satisfying part wasn't knowing he was unraveling. It was knowing I no longer needed to watch. I found out how bad it had got for Thomas the same way I'd found out most of the truth in my life, indirectly, through systems doing exactly what they were designed to do once someone stopped shielding him from consequences. A compliance officer called to confirm a detail, careful not to overshare, but her tone told me enough. What Thomas had treated as a clever workaround was now being examined as a pattern of intent. His accounts remained frozen. His credit lines were suspended pending review. His professional license, something he'd always worn like armor, was under investigation because false filings don't stay contained. They radiate outward, touching everything connected to them. People who had once returned his calls immediately were now routing him through assistants. Meetings were postponed. Contracts were reconsidered. I imagined him sitting alone in his office, surrounded by framed certificates and polished wood, finally realizing that certainty is a fragile thing when it's built on deception. And yet what surprised me most wasn't his downfall, it was my own detachment from it. I didn't feel vindicated, I felt finished. Finished explaining, finished proving, finished absorbing the emotional labor of someone else's choices. One afternoon, as I updated my records at a government office, a clerk looked up, smiled warmly, and said, "Welcome back, Ms. Carter." The words caught in my chest. Welcome back not just to a database or a system, but to myself. I walked out into the sunlight feeling whole in a way I hadn't in years, aware that whatever story Thomas told himself now no longer included me. He could keep the wreckage. I was already gone, just not in the way he'd planned. I never saw Thomas again, not in a courtroom, not in a hallway, not even across a street where our eyes might accidentally meet. By the time the investigations concluded and the truth settled into official language, he had become irrelevant to the life I was building. My name was restored. My accounts were mine again. My future no longer required vigilance, only intention. What he lost wasn't just money or reputation, it was the privilege of existing in my story. And that, I've learned, is the most complete form of revenge there is. When you stop explaining yourself to people who never intended to listen, you don't just move on, you rise above the version of yourself they tried to erase. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been betrayed quietly, methodically, by someone who assumed your silence meant surrender, tell me, have you lived through something like this? And where are you listening from? Leave it in the comments. I read every one. If you want more stories like this, real stories about dignity, patience, and consequences that don't need shouting, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And never forget this, no matter how quietly the world tries to write you out, don't underestimate the power of women. And Merry Christmas.